Welcome aboard. We hope you enjoy everything we create. Subscribe, stay connected, and let's grow together. Thank you for your support. I should start at the beginning, or what felt like the beginning, although I have come to understand that beginnings are arbitrary. You can point to any moment and call it the start, and you will be both right and wrong. But for the purposes of this story, for the shape I need to give it so that it makes sense to you and to me, I will start with a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1989, when I was 8 years old and standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. My mother was at church. She attended a Baptist congregation on Bearden Hill every Sunday morning and most Wednesday evenings, and she took my younger sister with her, but left me at home because I had been running a low fever the night before. My father was in the garage, doing what he always did on Sunday afternoons when my mother was not around, which was drink beer and listen to country music on a portable radio and tinker with the lawnmower or the truck or whatever engine was nearest to his hands. He was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy and dishonest to paint him as a villain in this story. He was a quiet man, a heavy man, a man who had grown up in the mountains east of Gatlinburg and who had learned from his own father that the proper response to any emotion too large for the body was to pick up a wrench and make yourself useful. He worked second shift at a textile plant, and on his days off he fixed things. That was his language. Broken things needed fixing. Whole things needed to be left alone. I was not broken. I want you to understand that. I was not broken then, and I am not broken now, and one of the reasons I am telling you this story is because I spent an unreasonable portion of my life believing otherwise. But on that Sunday afternoon, I was just a boy with a fever standing in a doorway, and what I saw on the bed was my mother's Sunday dress laid out flat on the chenille bedspread, the one she wore to church, a navy blue thing with white piping along the collar and small pearl buttons down the front. She had laid it out the night before because she was meticulous about preparation, and there it was, arms outstretched on the bed like a person resting, and I stood looking at it, and I felt something. I've spent more than 30 years trying to find the right word for what I felt. It was not desire. It was not excitement. It was not even curiosity, exactly. It was more like recognition. It was the feeling you get when you see a place you have never been but you are certain you have dreamed about. It was the feeling of a word sitting on the tip of your tongue, a word you have never actually learned, but that you know exists in a language you almost speak. I stood in that doorway, and I looked at that dress, and something inside me said, without words, without any language I had access to at 8 years old, that belongs to me. Not the dress itself, not the object, but whatever that dress represented, whatever it was a doorway to. I did not touch it. I want you to know that. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, and then I heard my father bump something in the garage, a metal-on-metal sound, and I walked away. I went to my room, and I lay on my bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I tried to forget what I had felt, because even at 8 years old, even without vocabulary, without any framework for understanding what had just happened, I knew that what I had felt was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way that touching a hot stove is dangerous. Dangerous in the way that being different is dangerous. I had already learned, through the relentless socialization of a small southern town, through the schoolyard and the church pew and the television set, and the way the men in my family talked about other men, that there were certain kinds of different that could end your life. Not physically, although sometimes physically, but socially, emotionally. The kind of different that made people stop looking at you as a person and start looking at you as a problem. So I filed that feeling away. I put it in a drawer inside myself, and I closed the drawer, and I did not open it again for a long time. But the thing about drawers is that they do not erase what is inside them. They just hide it. And the thing about feelings is that they do not decompose. They do not rot or fade or evaporate. They sit. They wait. They accumulate interest. I grew up in the 90s in Knoxville, in a world that was structurally simple and internally complex. Structurally simple means that everyone I knew went to the same kind of church, ate the same kind of food, drove the same kind of truck, and believed the same kind of things about what men were supposed to be, and what women were supposed to be, and what happened to people who crossed the line between those two categories. Internally complex means that underneath that structural simplicity, every single person I knew was carrying something they could not talk about. My father carried his father's silence. My mother carried her sister's death, which had happened when they were both teenagers and which nobody mentioned anymore, as if not mentioning it could reverse the fact of it. My uncle carried a war he would not name. My grandmother carried poverty so deep it had become part of her skeleton, visible in the way she hoarded butter and folded aluminum foil, and never threw away a jar. Everyone was carrying something. But nobody talked about what they carried, because talking about what you carried was a form of weakness, and weakness, in the world I grew up in, was the one sin that could not be forgiven. I was a quiet child. Not shy exactly. Shy implies a reluctance to engage. I was more like watchful. I observed. I catalogued. I kept a running inventory of what was safe and what was not safe, what could be said, and what could not be said, who was accepted and who was excluded, and why. I learned to read rooms before I learned to read books, which is a skill that serves you well when you are hiding something, even when you do not know what you are hiding. School was fine. I was not popular, and I was not unpopular. I occupied the gray middle zone that most kids occupy, the zone of adequate social camouflage. I made friends. I played sports badly. I went to church. I did my homework. I was, by every external measure, a normal boy. And inside, in that drawer I had closed, something was pressing against the wood. The pressing got worse when I was about 12. This is the age when the body begins to assert itself, when biology and identity start having arguments that the mind is not equipped to mediate. My body was doing what male bodies do at 12, and my mind was doing something else entirely. I did not have language for it. I did not have the internet, which would not arrive in our house for another 4 years. I did not have books or television shows or movies that depicted anyone like me, unless they were depicted as jokes, as cautionary tales, as things to be laughed at or run away from. The only references I had were the vague, ugly caricatures that floated through the culture, the men in dresses on sitcoms played for laughs, the comments my father's friends made about people they saw on the news, the sermons at church that touched on the topic with the same delicate precision of a sledgehammer. So, I did what most people do when they cannot name what they are feeling and have no permission to explore it. I converted the feeling into something else. I converted it into anxiety. I converted it into stomachaches that kept me home from school. I converted it into a perfectionism that drove me to make straight A's and never get in trouble and never stand out and never, under any circumstances, draw attention to myself. I became the kind of teenager who was so good, so quiet, so compliant, that no adult ever thought to ask what was wrong because nothing appeared to be wrong. I had perfected the art of appearing fine. But there were nights. I want to be honest with you about the nights. There were nights when everyone in the house was asleep, and I would lie in my bed, and the drawer would open by itself, the way drawers do when the lock is not real, and the feeling would come out and sit on my chest like something with weight and breath, and I would stare at the ceiling and think about my mother's navy blue dress, and I would wonder what was wrong with me. I would pray. I was a praying teenager, which is perhaps not surprising given the environment, and I would pray for God to take this away. I would pray for whatever was inside me to be removed, the way you pray for a tumor to be benign, the way you pray for a fever to break. I prayed with the desperate, bargaining faith of a child who believes that if he is good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, God will fix what is broken. And every morning I would wake up, and the feeling would still be there, and I would close the drawer, and go to school and be fine. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever prayed for part of themselves to be removed. I want you to hear me very clearly. The part of yourself that you are praying to have removed is not a tumor. It is not a fever. It is not a malfunction. It is a room in your house that you have not furnished yet. It is a wing of your identity that you have not walked through because nobody gave you the key, and the hallway is dark, and you were taught to be afraid of the dark. But the room is yours. It has always been yours. And the feeling you have when you stand in the doorway of that room, the feeling I had standing in my parents' doorway at 8 years old, is not shame. It is recognition. It is your own self trying to introduce itself to you. The tragedy is not that we have these rooms. The tragedy is that we spend so long barricading the doors that by the time we finally walk through, we have forgotten what we were looking for. I did not understand any of this at 12. I did not understand it at 15 or 18 or 21. I was still barricading. I was still praying. I was still converting the feeling into anxiety and perfectionism and the careful, exhausting performance of being someone I was not. I graduated high school in 1999 and went to the University of Tennessee, which was close enough to home that my mother was happy and far enough away that I could breathe, or at least I thought I could breathe. College was the first place I encountered people who were different in the ways I was different, although I did not recognize them as such at first. There was a student in my sociology class, a person I will call Alex, who wore makeup and clothes that did not conform to any gender category I had been taught, and who spoke in class with a confidence that I found both terrifying and magnetic. I remember sitting in the back row of that lecture hall and watching Alex talk about social construction, about how the categories we treat as natural and fixed are actually just agreements, collective agreements that can be renegotiated, and I remember feeling something crack inside my chest, not painfully, but like ice on a river in spring, that first sound of structural failure before the water begins to move. But I did not approach Alex. I did not ask questions. I did not join the conversation. I sat in the back row, and I took notes, and I went home and I closed the drawer. Because I was still living in the world I had grown up in, even if I had geographically moved a few miles down the road. The world I had grown up in was inside me, and it had guards posted at every door, and the guards were my father's voice and my mother's faith and the schoolyard taunts I had heard since I was 5 and the sermons about how God made man and woman, and anything that blurred that line was an abomination, and those guards were very good at their job. I dated girls in college. I want to talk about this because it is important and because it is a part of the story that I have had to think about very carefully in terms of honesty and responsibility. I dated women because I was attracted to women, and that attraction was and is real, and I do not want to suggest that my relationships were fraudulent or that I was using anyone. But I also dated women because dating women was safe. Dating women was the thing my father expected. Dating women was the narrative I had been handed, and I followed it because following it meant I did not have to ask questions about myself. Each relationship was genuine in its way, but each relationship also had a wall in it, a wall I could not name, a wall behind which I kept the drawer and everything inside it, and eventually every woman I dated sensed that wall and asked about it, and I had no answer to give them, and so the relationships ended one by one, not with explosions but with the quiet erosion of two people who could not reach each other fully. I graduated in 2003 with a degree in business management, which is a degree that sounds practical, but is really just a way of saying you spent 4 years learning how to maintain systems you did not design. I moved to Nashville because a friend from college had a connection at a logistics company there, and I got a job doing freight coordination, which is a job that sounds boring and is boring, but which I was good at because it required the exact skills I had spent my life developing. Organization, attention to detail, the ability to track multiple moving parts without losing track of any single one, and above all, the ability to appear calm while managing chaos. Freight coordination is, in many ways, the perfect job for someone who has spent their entire life managing internal chaos while appearing calm. Nashville was where I met Ellen. I want to talk about Ellen carefully, and with the respect she deserves, because she is the most important person in the story, and because the story I am telling is not just mine. It is also hers, and I do not have the right to tell her parts of it without acknowledging that what I am sharing is filtered through my perspective and my memory and my guilt and my gratitude. Ellen is a real person with her own interior life, her own story, her own rooms that she has walked through, or chosen not to walk through, and I want to be clear that what I am telling you about her is what I experienced of her, which is not the same as what she is. Ellen was a nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She was 2 years older than me, which at 24 and 26 felt like nothing, and at 34 and 36 felt like everything, or maybe that is not right. Maybe it just felt like nothing both times, and I am trying to inject meaning where there is none. She was from Chattanooga. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room even when the room was full. She did not interrupt. She did not look at her phone. When you talked, she leaned forward slightly, and her eyes did not wander, and when you finished, she paused before responding, a pause that felt like she was actually considering what you had said rather than waiting for her turn to speak. I had never experienced anything like it. I had grown up in a world of people who listened in order to respond, not in order to understand, and Ellen listened in order to understand, and it was the most disarming thing I had ever encountered. We met at a friend's birthday party at a bar in Midtown. I was standing near the window trying to look like I was comfortable at parties, which I was not and never have been, and she was standing near the window trying to look like she was not bored, which she was, and we started talking about the music that was playing, which was bad. And the conversation moved from bad music to good music to books to family to the question of why we both seemed to be standing near the window instead of participating in the party. And by the end of the night I had the sense that I had met someone who could see the wall I kept behind my words, although she had not tried to climb it yet, and I was both relieved and terrified by that. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. 2 years of dinners and movies and weekend trips, and the slow, gradual process of two cautious people learning to trust each other. 2 years during which the drawer remained closed.
I want to be honest about that.
I was in love with Ellen, genuinely in love, and I still did not tell her. I told her about my childhood. I told her about my father's silence and my mother's faith and the anxiety I had carried since I was 12. I told her things I had never told anyone, but I did not tell her about the drawer. I did not tell her about the navy blue dress. I did not tell her about the nights, because the nights were the one thing I could not translate into language, and I was afraid that if I tried, she would leave, and the possibility of Ellen leaving was more terrifying to me than the possibility of spending the rest of my life in that drawer. We got married in 2007 at a church in Chattanooga. Her family was there. My family was there. My father shook my hand and said something brief and gruff that I think was congratulations. My mother cried. Ellen's mother cried. Everyone cried. I did not cry because I had trained myself not to cry, because crying was a form of weakness and weakness was the unforgivable sin, but I remember standing at the altar and looking at Ellen in her wedding dress and feeling something that I can only describe as a profound and complicated hope. The hope that maybe loving someone this much would be enough to fill the drawer, to make the thing inside it unnecessary, to finally and permanently close it.
I was wrong about that.
But I did not know I was wrong yet. I would not know for several more years. The first few years of marriage were good. They were genuinely good, and I do not want to retroactively poison them with the knowledge of what came later, because that would be dishonest. Ellen and I built a life together. We bought a house in a suburb south of Nashville. We adopted a dog, a beagle mix we named Clementine. We had friends over for dinner. We went on vacations. We fought about money and housework and whose family to visit on holidays, the way all couples fight. We had a real marriage, a functional marriage, a marriage that from the outside looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. And every night, after Ellen fell asleep, the drawer would open. I want to describe what this was like because I think it is important for understanding what I went through and what many people go through. Imagine that you are standing in a house that you built yourself, a house that is warm and solid and full of things you love, and you know that there is a room in this house that you have never entered. You know the room exists because you can feel it. You can feel it the way you feel a draft, the way you feel someone watching you, the way you feel the weight of an unspoken word. And every night when the house is quiet, you walk to the door of that room and you put your hand on the handle and you stand there and you do not turn the handle and you do not open the door and you do not go in. And then you go back to bed and you lie next to the person you love and you pretend that the room does not exist. And you do this every night for years. And then not going in becomes its own kind of torture. A torture that is invisible to everyone except you. A torture that does not leave marks or scars, but that hollows you out from the inside like water eroding limestone. That is what it was like. That is what the first 3 years of my marriage were like underneath the surface. Good on the surface. Eroding underneath. The thing that changed everything, or rather the thing that began the change, because change is never a single event. Change is a process that starts long before you notice it and continues long after you think it is finished. The thing that began the change happened in the spring of 2011. I was 30 years old. Ellen and I had been married for 4 years. And I found myself alone in the house on a Saturday afternoon because Ellen was working a double shift at the hospital and I had no plans and the dog was asleep on the couch and the house was quiet in that specific way that houses are quiet when no one is watching, and I did something I had never done before. I opened Ellen's closet. I want to be very clear about what I did and what I did not do because the way the story is told matters. I did not do anything sexual. I did not do anything that violated Ellen or her belongings in any physical way. I opened the closet door, and I stood there, and I looked at her clothes, her dresses and blouses and skirts arranged by color, because she was meticulous about organization, and I felt what I had felt at 8 years old standing in my parents' doorway. Recognition. The word on the tip of my tongue. The room in the house I had not furnished. I stood there for a long time. I do not know how long. Long enough that the dog woke up and came to see what I was doing and sat at my feet and looked up at me with the patient, non-judgmental gaze that dogs have, and I looked down at her and I said, out loud to the dog, to the empty house. To myself, I said, "What is wrong with me?" And the dog did not answer, because dogs cannot answer, but the house answered, or the silence answered, or something inside me answered, and what it said was, nothing. Nothing is wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not sick. You're standing in front of a door, and you are afraid to walk through it, and the fear is not the same as the thing behind the door, and the thing behind the door is not the same as the fear. I did not try anything on that day. I want you to know that. I closed the closet, and I sat on the bed, and I breathed, and I did not try anything on. But something had shifted. The lock on the drawer, the lock I had been checking every day for 22 years, the lock that I had prayed over and wept over and reinforced with every social convention I had ever absorbed, that lock had loosened. Not broken. Not removed. Just loosened. Just enough that I could feel the drawer sliding open on its own more often, more insistently, with a weight that was harder to push back. For the next 2 years, I lived in a state of quiet crisis. I want to describe this state because I think it is the state that many people live in for long periods of their lives, and I think naming it is important. Quiet crisis is not the same as loud crisis. Loud crisis is visible. Loud crisis is the breakdown, the hospital visit, the phone call at 3 in the morning, the event that everyone can see and respond to. Quiet crisis is the slow erosion that happens underneath the surface, while everything above the surface appears normal. Quiet crisis is going to work every day and doing your job well and coming home and eating dinner with your wife and watching television and going to bed and lying awake for 2 hours while the drawer opens and the feeling sits on your chest and you try to breathe around it. Quiet crisis is functional. Quiet crisis is invisible. Quiet crisis is the thing that people mean when they say, after someone has done something drastic, I had no idea. They had no idea because the crisis was quiet. During this period, I did something that I had never done before and that I want to tell you about because I think it is a turning point that many people in similar situations will recognize. I started searching, not for clothes, not for anything physical. I started searching for words. I went on the internet late at night in the privacy of my home office and I started typing things into search engines that I had never typed before. I typed the word crossdressing and I read what came up, and most of it was not helpful. Most of it was either clinical and pathologizing, describing what I felt as a disorder, a paraphilia, a dysfunction, or it was sexualized, framed as a fetish, as something erotic, as something that existed in the domain of arousal rather than identity, and neither of these framings fit what I was experiencing. What I was experiencing was not erotic. It was not a dysfunction. It was a sense of self trying to express itself in a language I had not been taught. I kept searching. I found forums, online communities, places where people talked about their experiences with honesty and vulnerability that I found staggering. I read stories from men who had worn women's clothing in secret for decades, from men who had told their wives and been rejected, from men who had told their wives and been accepted, from men who had realized through the process of exploration that they were not men at all, that the crossdressing was a first step toward a larger truth about their gender identity. And from men who had realized that the crossdressing was exactly what it was, an expression of something within them that was not about gender identity, but about gender expression, about the freedom to move outside the narrow box they had been placed in, about the relief of letting a part of themselves breathe that had been suffocating for years. I read these stories and I wept. I wept in front of my computer at 2 in the morning with the door to my home office closed and the sound of Ellen breathing in the next room barely audible through the wall, and I wept not out of sadness, but out of the overwhelming relief of discovering that I was not alone. That there were other people who had stood in doorways and felt recognition. That there were other people who had prayed for a part of themselves to be removed and had woken up every morning to find it still there. that there were other people who had built entire lives around a closed drawer and who had, eventually at various ages and in various ways, opened it. But reading other people's stories and beginning to live your own are very different things. Reading is passive. It is safe. You can close a browser window. You cannot close a life once you have started changing it. And so for 2 more years I read, and I searched, and I did nothing because doing nothing was still the safest option, and safety was the highest value I had been taught. Safety and normalcy, and the avoidance of anything that might make you stand out or be seen as different or invite the kind of attention that could destroy the life you had built. The pressure of doing nothing, however, has a cost, and the cost was my mental health. I want to talk about this because I think it is crucial. During this period, I developed insomnia. I lost weight. I became irritable in ways that were unlike me, snapping at Ellen over small things, withdrawing from social situations, canceling plans, spending weekends alone in the house while Ellen visited her family. I was depressed, although I did not call it depression at the time. I called it stress. I called it work pressure. I called it being tired. I called it anything except what it was, because what it was the cost of living a lie, and I was not ready to admit that I was lying, because admitting that I was lying meant admitting that there was a truth, and the truth was the drawer, and the drawer was the thing I could not face. Ellen noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a nurse, and more than that, she was my wife, and she paid attention. And one evening in the fall of 2013, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table after dinner, and she said, "Something is wrong." Not as a question. As a statement. Something is wrong with you, and you are not telling me what it is, and I need you to tell me. I said nothing. I sat there, and I said nothing. The silence between us grew until it filled the kitchen, until it pressed against the walls, until it became a physical thing, a presence at the table, a third person sitting between us. And Ellen looked at me, and I looked at the table, and the silence went on, and finally she said, "Okay. Okay. When you are ready." And she stood up and she cleared the dishes and she did not press further, and I sat at that table for another hour after she left, and I thought about what I would say if I were ready, and I did not know, and so I said nothing, and the nothing became another brick in the wall between us. I want to pause here and address something directly because I think it is one of the most important things I can say in this story. The cost of hiding is not paid only by the person hiding. Ellen was paying for my silence. Our marriage was paying for it. Every relationship I had was paying for it, because you cannot compartmentalize yourself and expect the compartments to be airtight. The thing you are hiding leaks. It leaks into your mood, your energy, your availability, your intimacy, your capacity to be present with the people you love. You think you are protecting them by not telling them, but what you are actually doing is denying them the chance to know you fully. And a relationship with a person who is partially unknown is a relationship that is always, at some level, lonely. I was not protecting Ellen by hiding. I was depriving her. I was depriving her of the truth, and the truth is the foundation of intimacy, and without intimacy a marriage is just a shared address.
I did not understand this at the time.
I understand it now, and I want anyone listening who is in a similar situation to hear it. Your silence is not protecting the people you love. Your silence is a wall between you and them, and the wall is made of love, which is the cruelest irony, because you built the wall out of love, to protect them, but the wall itself is the thing that is hurting them. The only way to protect someone from the truth is to tell them the truth, because the truth is the only thing that allows them to make an informed decision about how to love you. This is the lesson that took me the longest to learn. This is the lesson that cost me the most. And this is the lesson that I am sharing with you now in the hope that it might save you some of the time and pain it cost me. The thing that finally broke the silence was not a grand event. It was not a dramatic confrontation or a moment of crisis. It was an ordinary evening in January of 2014. Ellen and I had eaten dinner. We were sitting on the couch in the living room, the television on but neither of us watching it, the dog between us, the house quiet except for the low murmur of the news. Ellen was reading something on her phone. I was staring at the television without seeing it, and I felt the drawer open the way it always did in quiet moments, and the feeling came out and sat on my chest, and for the first time in my life I did not try to push it back. I let it sit there. I let it breathe. I let it exist. And then I opened my mouth, and I said something that I had never said out loud before, something that I had barely even allowed myself to think in the privacy of my own mind, something that came out of my mouth so quietly that Ellen did not hear it at first, and I had to say it again. I said, "I need to tell you something." Ellen looked up from her phone. She looked at me, and I want to tell you about the look on her face because it is burned into my memory with the permanence of a brand. It was not surprise. It was not fear. It was relief. She looked relieved. She looked like a person who had been standing in the rain for years and had just been told that the rain was about to stop. Because she had known. Not the specifics. Not the content of the drawer. But she had known that there was a drawer. She had known that there was a wall. She had known that I was carrying something, and the not knowing what had been its own kind of torment for her, and now I was about to tell her, and whatever it was, the telling itself was a relief, because at least the not knowing would be over. I said it. I will not give you the exact words, because the exact words were clumsy and inadequate and full of the stuttering, circular, apologetic language that people use when they are trying to explain something they do not fully understand themselves. But the essence was this. I told her that for as long as I could remember, I had felt something that I could not name. I told her about the navy blue dress. I told her about the closet. I told her about the nights. I told her about the searching and the forums and the crying at 2 a.m. I told her that I did not know what it meant. I told her that I was not sure if it was about identity or expression or something else entirely. I told her that I was scared. I told her that I did not want to lose her. I told her that I was sorry. I told her that I was sorry. And I want to talk about that because it is important. I said I was sorry because I had been hiding something from the person I loved most in the world, and that hiding had hurt her, and I was genuinely sorry for the hurt. But I also said I was sorry because I had been taught, by every force in my life, that what I was feeling was wrong, and when you believe that what you are feeling is wrong, you apologize for feeling it, and the apology is a form of self-punishment, a way of saying, I know this is unacceptable, and I am begging you not to punish me for it. And I want to say, to myself and to anyone listening, that you do not need to apologize for the truth. You can apologize for the hiding. You can apologize for the hurt your hiding caused. But you do not need to apologize for the truth, because the truth is not a crime. The truth is the minimum requirement for a life that is actually lived. Ellen listened. She listened the way she always listened, which is to say with her whole body, leaning forward, eyes steady, hands still in her lap. She did not interrupt. She did not look away. She did not pick up her phone. She listened to every word, and when I finished, when the words ran out, and I sat there emptied and exposed and terrified, she did something that I will remember for the rest of my life. She reached across the dog, and she took my hand. She did not say it is okay, because it was not okay, not yet, not in that moment. She did not say I understand, because she did not understand, not yet. She did not say anything that people say when they are trying to make a situation easier, because Ellen was not a person who tried to make things easier. She was a person who tried to make things honest. And what she said after a long pause, after she had held my hand and looked at me and let the silence do its work, what she said was, "Thank you for telling me." And then she said, "I need time." And then she said, "We will figure this out. We will figure this out. Not I will figure this out. Not you will figure this out. We." And that "we" was the most generous word anyone had ever spoken to me, more generous than any gift, more generous than any declaration of love, because it meant that she was not abandoning me and she was not pretending that everything was fine and she was not making my truth about her. She was standing next to me and she was saying, "This is ours now, and we will face it together, and the together is not conditional on me understanding it first." I want to be honest about what happened next because I do not want to give you the impression that Ellen's response meant that everything was suddenly easy. It was not easy. The days and weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of both of our lives. Ellen had questions, and her questions were fair and hard and necessary. She asked me if I was transgender. I said I did not know. She asked me if I wanted to transition. I said I did not know. She asked me if I was attracted to men. I said no, and this was true, and I want to address this because it is one of the most common misconceptions about crossdressing and gender exploration, the assumption that it is connected to sexual orientation. It is not. Or rather, it can be for some people, but it is not inherently, and for me it was not. My desire to explore feminine expression was not about who I was attracted to.
It was about who I was.
It was about a part of my identity that had been locked in a drawer for 22 years, and that was now, finally, demanding to be acknowledged. She asked me what I wanted, and I said something that was both the most honest and the most terrifying thing I had ever said to another person. I said, I want to try. I want to try wearing women's clothes.
Not all the time.
Not in public. Not yet. I want to try it here at home, and I want to see what it feels like, and I want to see if it is what I think it is, and I want you to be part of it if you are willing, because I do not want to do this in secret anymore. I do not want to hide. I want to do this with you, or not at all. Ellen looked at me for a long time, and then she said something that I did not expect. She said, I need to think about this, and I need to set some boundaries. And if we are going to do this, we are going to do it with intention. We are not going to do it in the middle of the night while I am sleeping. We are not going to do it in secret. We are going to do it in a way that respects both of us. And I need to write it down. Write it down, I said. Yes, she said. I need to write down the terms. What you need. What I need. What we are both comfortable with. What we are not comfortable with. And I need you to read it and agree to it. I need us to have a contract. A contract. The word sounded strange in that context, legal and formal, out of place in a conversation about identity and intimacy. But I have come to understand, in the years since, that what Ellen was doing was profoundly wise. She was creating a structure. She was taking something that had been formless and chaotic and secret, and she was giving it shape and boundaries and light. She was saying, we cannot navigate this by feel alone because the feelings are too big and too tangled and too frightening. We need a map. We need agreements. We need to know where we are going and how we are going to get there, and what we are both responsible for along the way. She spent a week writing it. I did not see it during that week. She wrote it in her office at the hospital during her lunch breaks. She told me later because she could not write it at home without me seeing, and she needed to write it alone, without my input, because she needed to figure out her own boundaries before she could negotiate mine. And during that week, I lived in a state of suspended terror, because I had told her the truth, and the truth was now in her hands, and she was shaping it into something, and I did not know what shape it would take, and the uncertainty was excruciating. The next Saturday evening after dinner, she handed me a piece of paper. It was 2 pages, handwritten in her neat, small, precise script. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once told me that something was wrong, and she watched me read it. I will not share the exact contents of the contract because it is private, because it belongs to our marriage, and because the specific terms of our agreement are not the point of the story. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters, because the shape is what I want anyone listening to take away from this. The contract had 3 sections. The first section was titled What I Need. In it, Ellen wrote about what she needed from me in order to feel safe and respected. She needed honesty. She needed to know when I was struggling, not after the fact, but in the moment. She needed to be consulted before any new step was taken, not because she wanted to control me, but because she wanted to be a participant in the process, not a bystander. She needed to know that this was not going to replace our relationship, that the part of me I was exploring was an addition to who I was, not a substitution. She needed to know that she was still seen, still valued, still loved. The second section was titled What You Need. In it, Ellen wrote what she understood about my needs, based on our conversation. She wrote that I needed space to explore. She wrote that I needed to do so without shame. She wrote that I needed to know that she was not going to leave, that her commitment to me was not conditional on my conformity to the person she had married, because the person she had married was a person who had been hiding, and the hiding was not a feature of my identity, it was a symptom of my fear, and she had not married my fear, she had married me. The third section was titled How We Will Do This. In it, she laid out a framework. She proposed that we start small, that I would have time at home, when she was present, to explore, that we would talk before and after each session, not to evaluate but to connect, that we would be honest about what felt right and what did not, that we would move at the pace of the slower person, which at that point was her, and that neither of us would push the other to go faster, that we would seek professional help, a therapist, someone who specialized in gender and identity issues, and that we would go together, that we would not tell anyone else until we were both ready, that this was our project, our journey, and that we would navigate it as a team. At the bottom of the second page, there was a line for my signature and a line for hers. Above the lines, she had written, "By signing this, we agree to face this together with honesty, patience, and respect. We agree that this is not a contract of restriction but a contract of care. We agree that either of us can renegotiate at any time. We agree that love is not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to stay in the room when the difficulty arrives." I read it twice. I read it 3 times. I sat at that kitchen table, and I held that piece of paper, and I felt something that I had never felt before, a feeling that was so unfamiliar that it took me several minutes to identify it. The feeling was safety. Not the safety of hiding, which is not safety at all, but a fragile, temporary insulation from risk. Real safety. The safety of being known. The safety of being in a room with another person who has seen the drawer and the thing inside it, and who has not left, who has instead sat down and written a document that says, "I see you, all of you, and I am staying." I signed it. I signed it with a shaking hand and tears on my face. The first tears I had cried in front of another person since I was a child. And Ellen signed it. And we sat there at the kitchen table with the contract between us and the dog at our feet and the house quiet around us, and I felt the drawer open one final time, and this time I did not try to close it. This time I let it stay open. This time I walked through the door. What followed was a process that I can only describe as excavation. Not of gender, not yet, although gender would become part of it later. Excavation of self. The act of exploring feminine expression was, for me, the act of digging through layers of accumulated fear and socialization and self-denial to find something underneath that was real and mine and had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. The first time I put on a dress, I want to tell you about it because it is a moment that has been misunderstood in almost every representation of crossdressing I have ever seen in media. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation scene with swelling music and a mirror reveal. It was a Tuesday evening in February of 2014. Ellen was home. She had laid out a simple black dress on our bed, her own dress, one she did not wear often, and a pair of flat shoes, and she had closed the curtains and she had put on music, something soft and instrumental, and she had said, "Whenever you are ready." I was not ready. I stood in the bedroom for 10 minutes before I touched the dress. The dress was just fabric.
I kept reminding myself of that.
It was just fabric, stitched into a shape, and the shape had no inherent meaning except the meaning that culture had assigned to it, and the meaning that culture had assigned to it was the source of all my fear, and the fear was not the dress, the fear was the meaning, and the meaning was negotiable, and I was here to renegotiate it. I put on the dress. It fit poorly because Ellen and I were not the same size, and the fabric pulled across my shoulders and hung loose at my waist, and I stood in front of the mirror, and I looked at myself, and I did not feel transformed. I did not feel like a different person. I felt like myself, wearing a dress that did not fit, standing in a bedroom with the curtains closed and soft music playing, and my wife sitting on the edge of the bed watching me with an expression that was careful and open and a little bit afraid. And then I felt it. The feeling, the recognition, the word on the tip of my tongue. But this time it was not distant. This time it was close. This time, standing in that ill-fitting dress in front of that mirror, I felt something click into place, not dramatically, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, settled certainty of a puzzle piece that has found its edge. Something in my body relaxed. Something in my chest loosened. Something that had been clenched for 22 years, a muscle I did not know I had, released, and I took a breath, a full breath, the kind of breath that goes all the way down to the bottom of your lungs, and I thought, oh, this is what it feels like. This is what it feels like to let a part of yourself breathe. I cried. I stood in that dress that did not fit, and I cried, and Ellen stood up and she held me. And she did not say anything because there was nothing to say, because the moment was complete in itself, and the silence was not empty, it was full. It was the fullest silence I had ever experienced, a silence that contained 22 years of suppression, and the release of that suppression, and the terror, and the relief, and the love, all of it, held in the space between two people in a bedroom on a Tuesday evening in February. I want to tell you that this moment solved everything. I want to tell you that from that night forward, The journey was smooth, and the path was clear, and Ellen and I walked hand in hand toward a beautiful resolution. But that would be a lie, and I promised you honesty, and the truth is that the moment in the bedroom was the beginning, not the end, and what followed was years of work. Years of difficult conversations and setbacks and moments of doubt and moments where Ellen and I both questioned whether we could do this, whether the cost was too high, whether the life we were building could contain this new dimension without collapsing. We started therapy, together first, then individually. Our therapist was a woman named Dr. Reeves, who had 20 years of experience working with gender and identity issues, and who had the rare quality of listening without agenda, of asking questions that opened doors rather than closing them, of creating a space where it was safe to say, "I do not know." I said, "I do not know a lot" in those early sessions. I do not know if I am transgender. I do not know if this is about identity or expression. I do not know if I want to transition. I do not know what I want my life to look like in 5 years. I do not know who I am. And Dr. Reeves would sit in her chair, and she would nod, and she would say, "You do not need to know. You need to explore. The knowing comes after the exploring, not before. You have spent your entire life trying to know before exploring, and that is why you are stuck. Stop trying to know. Start exploring." This was, perhaps, the most important piece of advice I received during this entire process. The cultural pressure to have a clear identity, to be able to label yourself, to fit into a category is enormous. We live in a world that demands definitions. Are you this or are you that? Are you male or female? Are you straight or gay? Are you cisgender or transgender? The demand for binary clarity is relentless, and for someone in my position, someone who was exploring something that did not fit neatly into any category, the demand was paralyzing. I felt that I had to figure out what I was before I could be it, and Dr. Reeves was telling me that this was backwards. She was telling me that I had to be it before I could figure out what it was. I had to move. I had to act. I had to put on the dress and see how it felt. I had to go out eventually and see how that felt. I had to let the experience teach me, rather than trying to predetermine the lesson. So I explored. At home. At first. Always with Ellen's knowledge, and often with her present. I tried different clothes. I learned about fit and fabric and the way garments interact with bodies, which is a language I had never been taught, and which I found both fascinating and humbling. I learned that the way clothes feel on your body is not trivial. The way clothes feel on your body is information. It is data about who you are and how you want to exist in physical space. For most of my life, I had treated clothing as neutral, as functional, as something that covered the body and met social requirements and nothing more. Now I was learning that clothing was communication, not just with others but with yourself, and that the communication could be honest or dishonest, and that for 22 years I had been wearing clothes that communicated something untrue. Ellen and I had hard conversations. Many hard conversations. There were nights when she cried, not because she was ashamed of me, but because she was grieving. She was grieving the person she thought she had married, the simplified version of me that she had constructed based on the information I had given her, which was incomplete, and the grief was real, and I had to learn to sit with it without trying to fix it, without trying to make her feel better, without trying to reassure her that nothing had changed, because things had changed. And pretending otherwise would have been another form of the hiding that had brought us here in the first place. There were also nights when I wanted to quit. Nights when the weight of it felt too heavy and the cost felt too high, and I thought, maybe I can just close the drawer again. Maybe I can go back to the way things were. Maybe the feeling will fade if I ignore it long enough. But I knew, by then, that the feeling would not fade. I had 30 years of evidence that the feeling did not fade. And I knew that going back to the drawer would mean going back to the insomnia and the anxiety and the erosion, and I could not do that to myself, and more importantly, I could not do that to Ellen because Ellen had signed a contract that said we would face this together, and going back to the drawer would have been a violation of that contract, a violation of the trust she had placed in me, and I was done violating trust. I was done hiding. I had been hiding my entire life, and the hiding had nearly killed me, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that left marks, but in the slow, quiet way that hiding kills people by making them strangers to themselves, and I was done being a stranger to myself. Over the next year, I explored more. I went out in public for the first time, not in a dress, not fully, but in small ways. I wore a camisole under my work shirt. I painted my toenails, which nobody could see because I wore socks and shoes, but I knew they were there, and the knowing was a small, private affirmation that I carried with me through the day like a secret that was not quite a secret anymore, a secret that was transitioning into a truth. I grew my hair longer. I started wearing a small amount of makeup. Nothing visible, just foundation to even out my skin, but the act of applying it, the ritual of standing in front of the mirror, and using the tools that I had watched my mother use and my wife use, the tools that I had been told were not for me, the act of using them was a form of self-recognition that went deeper than the visual result. I told my therapist about these small steps, and she asked me how they felt, and I said they felt like breathing. They felt like coming up from underwater. They felt like the first stretch after being in a cramped position for too long, that combination of relief and pain because the stretching itself hurts, the muscles protest, the body has grown accustomed to the cramped position, and the uncramping is its own kind of discomfort, but the discomfort is the discomfort of healing, not the discomfort of injury. And learning to tell the difference between those two kinds of discomfort was one of the most important skills I developed during this period. I want to talk about the discomfort of healing because I think it is widely misunderstood. When you begin to live more authentically after years of suppression, the process is not purely joyful. It is also painful. It is painful because you are not just acquiring a new way of being, you are grieving an old way of being, and the old way of being, however limited and false, was familiar, and familiarity is a form of comfort, and losing comfort is painful even when the comfort was built on a foundation of self-denial. There were days when I looked in the mirror and I felt joy, and there were days when I looked in the mirror and I felt grief, and some days I felt both at the same time, and Dr. Reeves told me that this was normal, that this was what growth felt like, that growth was not a linear progression from misery to happiness but a complex, recursive process that involved feeling many things at once and learning to hold them all without needing any of them to win. This was, I think, the deepest lesson of this period. Not the lesson about gender or expression or identity, although those lessons were important. The deepest lesson was about emotional capacity. It was about the ability to hold complexity, to feel contradictory things simultaneously, to be joyful and grieving at the same time, to be certain and uncertain at the same time, to be brave and terrified at the same time, and to understand that these contradictions do not need to be resolved. They need to be held. They need to be given space. They need to be allowed to coexist, the way colors coexist in a spectrum, the way notes coexist in a chord, the way the different parts of a life coexist in a single person. I had spent my entire life trying to resolve contradictions. I had tried to make the feeling go away so that it would not contradict the life I was living. I had tried to make the life work so that it would not contradict the feeling. I had spent enormous amounts of energy trying to force the different parts of myself into a single, coherent, non-contradictory identity, and the effort had exhausted me, and the effort had failed, and the failure had brought me to Ellen's kitchen table, and the contract, and the dress that did not fit. And now, in therapy, in exploration, in the slow and deliberate process of letting myself be more than one thing at a time, I was learning that coherence does not mean the absence of contradiction. Coherence means the integration of contradiction. Coherence means being a person who contains multitudes and who does not require those multitudes to agree with each other in order to feel whole. This was the period I think of as reflection, although it was not purely reflective. It was active. I was doing things, trying things, taking small risks. But underneath the activity was a deep, continuous process of reflection, of asking myself questions that I had never asked, of examining assumptions I had never examined, of looking at the architecture of my identity and asking which of these walls are load-bearing and which are decorative, which of these beliefs are mine, and which were installed by forces outside of me, which of these fears are rational, and which are inherited. I examined my relationship with masculinity. This was one of the hardest and most important reflections. I had to ask myself what masculinity meant to me, not what it meant to the culture, not what it meant to my father, not what it meant to the church or the schoolyard or the television, but what it meant to me personally in the privacy of my own experience. And what I found was that much of what I had been calling masculinity was not a genuine expression of myself, but a performance designed to meet external expectations. The stoicism, the competitiveness, the reluctance to ask for help, the equation of vulnerability with weakness, the refusal to cry, the need to appear in control at all times, None of these were things I had chosen. They were things I had absorbed, the way you absorb the accent of the place where you grow up, not through conscious decision but through immersion, through the steady, daily, almost invisible process of living in a world that rewards conformity and punishes deviation. And I had to ask myself, was I rejecting masculinity? Was the cross-dressing a rejection of being male? And the answer, after much reflection, was no. The answer was more complicated and more interesting than that. The answer was that I was not rejecting masculinity. I was rejecting the idea that masculinity was all I was allowed to be. I was rejecting the box, not the contents of the box. I was saying, I am a man and I am also this, and the also this does not cancel the man, it complicates him, it enriches him, it makes him more than a category, it makes him a person. This distinction between rejecting a category and rejecting the constraints of a category was one that took me a long time to articulate and that I think is widely misunderstood. When people see a man wearing a dress, they often assume that the man is rejecting manhood, that he is saying, I am not a man, I am something else. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes the exploration of feminine expression is indeed a step toward a realization that the person is not, or is not only, a man, and that is a valid and important path. But sometimes, and this was my case, the exploration is not a rejection of manhood but an expansion of it. It is a man saying, my manhood is large enough to contain this. My identity is not threatened by the fact that I find joy and peace and self-recognition in something that the culture has labeled feminine. My identity is not a fortress that must be defended against incursion. My identity is a house with many rooms, and I am walking through all of them, and I am finding that they are all mine. I shared this reflection with Ellen, and she listened, and she said something that I think about often. She said, I think I have been doing the same thing. Not with clothes, not with gender expression, but with the roles I have been assigned. The good wife, the good nurse, the good daughter, the good woman. I have been performing those roles my entire life, and I have never asked myself which parts of the performance are me and which parts are expectation. And watching you do this, watching you examine the architecture of your identity, has made me want to examine the architecture of mine. This was one of the unexpected gifts of the process. It was not just my identity that was being explored. It was ours. The contract Ellen had written was not just about my cross-dressing. It was about honesty and self-knowledge and the willingness to look at yourself clearly, and those principles, once established in a relationship, do not stay confined to the issue that originated them. They spread. They become part of the relationship's operating system. Ellen and I began having conversations about things we had never discussed, not just about gender and expression, but about everything. About our fears. About our disappointments. About the gap between the lives we had imagined and the lives we were living. About the things we wanted that we had been afraid to want. The contract had opened a door, and the door did not just lead to the room I had been avoiding. It led to every room we had been avoiding, and we walked through them together, and the walking through is painful and liberating in equal measure. I want to talk now about the social dimension of this journey, because it is the part that I have not yet addressed, and it is the part that many people fear the most. For the first 2 years after I told Ellen, we kept the exploration private. It happened at home, in controlled environments, with the curtains closed and the door locked and the outside world unaware. And this was necessary. This was the pace that Ellen and I had agreed to. This was the container that allowed the exploration to happen safely. But eventually the container began to feel like a cage, not because the container was wrong, but because I had grown beyond it and the growth required more space. The first person I told outside of Ellen and my therapist was my younger sister, Clara. I chose Clara because she was the person in my family I trusted most, because she had always been more open-minded than the rest of our family, because she lived in Asheville, which is a city that has more room for difference than Knoxville, and because I needed to practice telling the story in a lower-stakes environment before I faced higher-stakes ones. I drove to Asheville on a Saturday in the spring of 2015. I sat in Clara's kitchen, which was bright and full of plants and smelled like coffee, and I told her. I used the same stumbling, inadequate language I had used with Ellen, but this time it came out a little more smoothly because I had practiced now, because I had been living with the truth for over a year, and the truth had become more solid, more shaped, more sayable. Clara listened. She did not reach across the table and take my hand, because Clara is not a hand-holding person. She is a leaning back and processing person, a person who needs space to absorb information before she responds. And I gave her the space and I sat there and I waited. And after a while she said, "I have questions." She asked questions. Good questions. Questions that were not hostile, but were not performatively accepting either. She asked me how long I had felt this way. I told her since I was 8. She asked me if I was happy. I said, "I am happier than I have ever been, and I am also more scared than I have ever been, and both of those things are true at the same time." She asked me about Ellen, and I told her about the contract, and Clara looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as admiration, not for me but for Ellen, and she said, "She wrote you a contract." She said, "That woman loves you." And I said, "I know." And Clara said, "Okay. I do not fully understand this yet. But I love you and I want to understand it, and I will." That was the first conversation. It was not the last. Clara and I talked many more times over the following months, and each conversation went a little deeper and her understanding grew, and mine grew, because explaining something to someone who is genuinely trying to understand is itself a form of understanding, and I found that each time I told the story became clearer to me. The way a path becomes clearer the more you walk it. Telling my parents was a different matter. I put it off for another year because I was afraid, and the fear was not irrational. My parents were older, my father was in poor health, and they lived in a world that had very little room for what I was about to tell them. My mother's faith was the center of her life, and her faith, as she had received it and practiced it, did not have a category for what I was describing. My father's worldview was even more rigid, built on a foundation of tradition and conformity that left no space for deviation. I told them in the fall of 2016. I drove to Knoxville with Ellen because Ellen insisted on coming because the contract said we would face this together, and she was not going to let me face this alone. We sat in my parents' living room, in the same room where I had watched television as a child, where I had done homework at the coffee table, where I had lived the first 18 years of my life inside the drawer, and I told them. My mother cried. She cried the way she cried at my wedding, silently, with her hand over her mouth, as if she was trying to physically contain the emotion. My father did not cry. My father sat in his recliner and he looked at me and he did not say anything for a long time, and the silence was the silence of my childhood, the silence that meant disapproval, the silence that meant you have done something that cannot be undone, and I am trying to decide whether to respond with anger or with withdrawal. He chose withdrawal. He stood up and he walked out of the room and he went to the garage, and I heard the sound of a wrench on metal, the sound of my childhood, the sound of my father processing an emotion too large for his body by picking up a tool and making himself useful. And I sat in the living room with my mother and my wife, and I felt something that I had been afraid of feeling my entire life. I felt the cost of honesty. I felt the pain that truth can cause. Not because the truth is harmful, but because the truth disrupts, and disruption is painful, and the people you love are not always ready for the disruption, and their unreadiness is not your fault, but it is your problem, because you are the one who chose to speak, and speaking has consequences, and the consequences are not always kind.
My mother and I talked.
She asked me if I was sure. I said yes. She asked me if I had prayed about it. I said, I have prayed about it every day for 25 years, and I have come to believe that the praying was not asking God to change me, it was God trying to tell me something, and I was not listening. She did not like that answer. She shook her head. But she did not reject me. She said, I need time. The same words Ellen had said. I need time. And I gave her time because time was the thing I had been given by Ellen, by my therapist, by the process itself, and I had learned that time is not the enemy of truth. Time is the medium in which truth is absorbed. My father did not speak to me for 3 months. 3 months of silence. 3 months of phone calls that went to voicemail, of emails that were not returned, of a wall that he built between us that was made of the same material as the wall I had built between myself and my own truth. I recognized the wall because I had built one just like it. I recognized the silence because I had lived inside it for decades. And I did not push. I did not demand. I did not try to scale the wall or break it down. I waited. I sent him a letter, a physical letter, handwritten, in which I told him that I loved him and that I was still his son, and that nothing about what I had told him changed the fact that he was my father and I was his child, and that I wanted him in my life.
I did not ask him to understand.
I did not ask him to approve. I asked him only to stay. To stay in the room when the difficulty arrived, the way Ellen had stayed, the way the contract said we would stay. After 3 months, he called me. The call was brief. He said, "Your mother says you are coming for Christmas." I said, "Yes, if you want me to." He said, "Your mother wants you to come." And then he paused, and in the pause I heard the sound of a man trying to find words in a language that did not have the vocabulary he needed, and he said, "I do not understand this. But you are my son, and I love you. And that is all I know how to say. That is all I know how to say." I want you to sit with that for a moment. My father, who had spent his entire life communicating through wrenches and silence, who had never in my memory told me he loved me in those words, who had grown up in the mountains east of Gatlinburg in a world that had no room for this. My father said, "I love you, and that is all I know how to say." And it was enough. It was not everything. It was not understanding. It was not approval. It was not the warm, unconditional embrace that I might have wanted. But it was enough. It was a man standing at the edge of what he could comprehend and choosing not to retreat, but to stay, to say the only thing he knew how to say, and to let that be the bridge between us. I cried after that phone call. I cried in a way I had not cried since the night in the bedroom with the dress that did not fit. I cried because my father loved me, and because his love was real even though it was imperfect, and because imperfect love is still love, and because the insistence on perfect love, on perfect understanding, on perfect acceptance, is one of the great enemies of human connection. We do not need each other to be perfect. We need each other to be present. We need each other to stay in the room. We need each other to say, "I do not understand this, but I love you, and that is all I know how to say." Over the next several years, my father and I developed a new kind of relationship. It was not the relationship I had imagined in my fantasies of coming out. The fantasy where everyone understands immediately and embraces you fully, and the world rearranges itself to accommodate your truth. That fantasy is a fantasy, and believing in it sets you up for disappointment, because real people are not fantasy people, and real love is not fantasy love, and real acceptance is a process, not an event. What my father and I had was a process. It was a series of small, incremental steps. He started using my name again. He started asking about my life. He never asked about the crossdressing directly, but he stopped changing the subject when other people brought up topics related to gender or identity, and he once, exactly once, in the last year of his life, said something that I think was his version of an olive branch. He said, "Your mother showed me a picture of you in a dress. I looked at it. You looked like your mother." And then he went to the garage, and that was the end of the conversation, and I sat in the living room, and I understood that this was my father's way of saying, "I see you, and I am not looking away." My father died in the spring of 2019. He had a heart attack in the garage, appropriately enough, with a wrench in his hand, and the radio playing country music. I miss him. I miss him in a way that is complicated by everything that happened between us, complicated by the years of silence and the years of hiding and the 3 months when he would not speak to me, and the one time he said "I love you," and the one time he said I looked like my mother. I miss him because he was my father, and because his love was imperfect, and because imperfect love, when it is real, leaves a hole when it is gone that perfect love could never fill, because perfect love is an abstraction and imperfect love is a fact, and facts are what we actually live with, and the loss of a fact is a real loss, and the loss of an abstraction is not. I want to talk about where I am now, because this story has been mostly about the past, and the past, however important, is not where we live. We live in the present, and the present is where identity ultimately has to be lived, not in theory but in practice, not in the safety of a therapist's office or the privacy of a closed bedroom, but in the world, in the grocery store and the workplace and the family dinner and the ordinary, unglamorous, daily business of being a person. I am 45 years old as I write this. I live in the same house south of Nashville. Ellen and I are still married. Clementine the beagle died 2 years ago, and we adopted another dog, a rescue named Moose, who is larger and louder and less elegant, but who has the same patient, non-judgmental gaze that I have come to believe is the essential quality of dogs, the quality that makes them better than humans at certain kinds of companionship. I still work in logistics, although I have started my own company, a small freight brokerage that employs 6 people, and I am proud of it, not because it is impressive, but because it is mine, because I built it, because building something that is yours is one of the ways you learn who you are. I wear what I want. I want to be specific about this because I think specificity is where the meaning lives. I wear what I want, which means different things on different days. On some days, I wear what would be called men's clothes, because some days that is what feels right because my identity is not a fixed point but a range. And on some days the range includes flannel shirts and jeans and boots, and that is not a retreat or a failure. That is just where I am on that day. On other days, I wear what would be called women's clothes, a dress or a skirt or a blouse, and I wear these things to work and to the store and to dinner with friends, and I do not hide and I do not apologize and I do not perform, I just wear them. The way anyone wears the clothes that feel right on their body. I have learned that the goal is not to arrive at a fixed identity. The goal is to live in the process. The goal is to remain in conversation with yourself, to keep asking the question, to keep listening to the answer, and to allow the answer to change. I used to think that identity was a destination, a place you arrived at after sufficient exploration, a final answer to the question of who you are. I now understand that identity is a practice, not a destination. It is something you do, not something you find. It is the daily, ongoing act of choosing to be yourself in a world that would often prefer you to be something else, and the choosing never ends, and the self never stops evolving, and the evolution is not a problem to be solved, but a life to be lived. Ellen and I have renegotiated the contract several times over the years. The original contract was written for a specific moment, a specific crisis, a specific set of needs, and as we have grown, the contract has grown with us. We have added sections and removed sections and amended sections, and the document itself, which we keep in a folder in Ellen's desk, has become a kind of record of our marriage, a history of the conversations we have had, and the agreements we have reached, and the ways we have learned to hold each other's truths alongside our own. The contract is not a set of rules. It is a practice. It is the practice of sitting down together and saying, where are we now, and what do we need now, and how do we move forward now, and doing that not once but repeatedly, not as a crisis response but as a way of life. I want to address something that I think is important for anyone who is where I was, anyone who is standing in a doorway feeling recognition and terror in equal measure. I want to talk about what I wish I had known at the beginning, the things that would have saved me time and pain if someone had told me, the things that I am telling you now in the hope that they might be useful. First, you do not need to know what you are before you start. You do not need a label. You do not need a diagnosis. You do not need to have figured out whether this is about gender identity or gender expression or something else entirely. You need to explore. You need to move. You need to let the experience teach you. The knowing comes after the exploring, not before. This is not a test you can study for. It is a journey you have to walk. Second, you cannot do this alone. I tried to do it alone for 22 years, and the alone nearly destroyed me. You need people. You need a therapist if you can access one. You need at least one person in your life who knows the truth and who is willing to stay in the room with you while you figure it out. You need community, even if the community is just an online forum at 2 in the morning, even if the community is just one other person who says, I know what that feels like. You are not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. The silence that surrounds this experience is not evidence of aloneness. It is evidence of how many other people are also being silent. Third, honesty is not a single act. It is a practice. Telling someone the truth once is not enough. You have to keep telling the truth. You have to keep being honest about where you are and what you need and what you are feeling, even when the honesty is inconvenient, even when the honesty is frightening, even when the honesty might cause pain. Because the alternative, the hiding, causes more pain, and the pain of hiding is chronic and corrosive, while the pain of honesty is acute and healable, and acute healable pain is always preferable to chronic corrosive pain, even though the chronic corrosive pain feels safer, because it is familiar. Fourth, other people's reactions are not your responsibility. You are responsible for telling the truth. You are not responsible for how people receive it. My father's silence was not my fault. My mother's tears were not my fault. The discomfort that truth causes in others is not a reason to stop telling the truth. You can be compassionate about their discomfort without changing your truth to accommodate it. You can give them time without giving up yourself. You can love people without shrinking yourself to fit their understanding.
Fifth,
Identity is not a competition. There is no hierarchy of authenticity. You are not more valid if you transition, and you are not more valid if you do not. You are not more authentic if you wear dresses every day, and you are not less authentic if you wear them once a month. The validity of your identity is not measured by its visibility or its consistency or its conformity to any narrative, whether that narrative is the culture's narrative of what a man should be or the community's narrative of what a crossdresser should be. The validity of your identity is measured by one thing only, and that is whether it is honest. Is it honest? Is it true? Is it you? If it is, then it is valid, and no one, no institution, no tradition, no ideology, no person has the authority to tell you otherwise. Sixth, be patient with the people who love you. They are on their own journey, a journey they did not choose, a journey that was forced on them by your honesty, and their journey has its own pace, and its own obstacles, and its own terrain. You have been living with this truth for years. They are hearing it for the first time. The gap between your readiness and theirs is not a measure of their love. It is a measure of the different relationships you each have with the information. Give them the time you would have wanted for yourself, the time you did give yourself, the years and years of searching and reflecting and slowly, carefully opening the drawer. Seventh, do not wait. I want to say this as plainly as I can. Do not wait. I waited until I was 33 years old. I waited until the not telling had eroded my marriage and my mental health and my capacity to be present in my own life. I waited because I was afraid, and the fear was real, and the fear was not irrational, but the waiting did not protect me from the things I was afraid of. The waiting only prolonged the suffering. If you are standing in a doorway, if you are standing in front of a drawer that you have closed, if you are lying awake at night with a feeling sitting on your chest that you cannot name, do not wait. Find someone. Find a therapist. Find a hotline. Find a forum. Find a friend. Find one person you can tell, and tell them, and let the telling be the first step. It does not have to be perfect. It does not have to be complete. It does not have to be the whole truth. It just has to be a crack in the wall, a sliver of light, a small, honest word spoken into the dark. I think about my father often. I think about the garage and the wrench and the radio and the silence. I think about the way he processed emotion through his hands, the way he could not say what he felt, but he could fix a lawnmower, and the fixing was his way of saying, I am here, I am present, I am staying. I think about the fact that he never fully understood what I told him, and that he loved me anyway, and that the loving anyway is the highest form of love I have ever witnessed. Love that does not require understanding, love that does not require agreement, love that simply says, you are mine and I am not letting go. I think about my mother, who is still alive, who is in her late 70s, who still goes to church on Bearden Hill, who has, over the years, found her own way to hold this truth. She has not changed her theology. She has not revised her understanding of Scripture. But she has done something that I think is more important than either of those things. She has decided that her love for her son is larger than her theology. She has decided that the God she worships is larger than the categories she was taught. She has told me, in her own careful, faith-inflected language, that she believes God made me as I am, and that the making includes the drawer, and the dress, and the feeling, and the truth, and that her job is not to judge the making but to love what was made. I do not agree with all of her theology, and she does not agree with all of my choices, and we love each other, and the loving is enough. I think about Ellen. I think about the contract. I think about the night she handed me those 2 pages of handwritten terms and asked me to sign, and I think about the fact that she could have walked away. She could have decided that this was too much, that the person she married was not the person she discovered, that the life she had planned did not include this dimension, and she would have been within her rights to make that decision, and I would not have blamed her, and the story would have been different. But she did not walk away. She sat down and she wrote a contract, and the contract was not a surrender or an accommodation or a sacrifice. It was a declaration. It was a declaration that our marriage was big enough to hold the truth, that her love was strong enough to survive the disruption, that we were a team, and teams do not abandon each other when the terrain gets rough. Teams sit down and they make a plan and they move forward together, and that is what we did, and that is what we are still doing, and I am grateful for it every single day of my life. I think about the boy I was, standing in the doorway of his parents' bedroom, looking at a navy blue dress, feeling something he could not name. I want to go back to that boy. I want to kneel down beside him, and I want to say, there is nothing wrong with you. The feeling you are feeling is not a malfunction. It is a message. It is yourself trying to speak to you in the only language it has, and the language is not words, it is recognition, and the recognition is real, and the path it will lead you on will be long and frightening and painful and beautiful, and you will lose things and you will gain things, and the things you gain will be worth more than the things you lose, and the thing you will gain most of all is yourself, your whole self, the self that has been hiding in a drawer for too long, the self that deserves to breathe. I cannot go back to that boy. None of us can go back. The river of memory flows in one direction, and we can stand on its banks and look upstream and see the shape of where we have been, but we cannot step into the water and be carried backward. What we can do is tell the story. We can tell the story of the boy and the dress and the drawer and the contract and the garage and the kitchen table and the bedroom in February and the years of therapy and the slow, difficult, magnificent process of becoming ourselves. We can tell the story because the story is not just ours. The story belongs to everyone who has ever stood in a doorway and felt recognition. The story belongs to everyone who has ever prayed for a part of themselves to be removed and woken up to find it still there. The story belongs to everyone who has ever built a wall out of love and discovered that the wall was the thing causing the harm. I tell this story not because it is extraordinary. I tell it because it is ordinary. I tell it because there are millions of people living in drawers right now, millions of people who have closed a part of themselves away and who are lying awake at night with that part sitting on their chest. And those people need to hear that the drawer can be opened, that the opening is survivable, that the other side of the fear is not destruction but life, a fuller life, a more honest life, a life that is worth the cost of the fear. I tell this story because of Ellen. Because she taught me that love is not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to stay in the room when the difficulty arrives. Because she wrote a contract that was not a contract of restriction, but a contract of care. Because she showed me that the bravest thing a person can do is not to face the world alone, but to turn to the person next to them and say, I need you, and I'm going to let you in, even though letting you in is the most terrifying thing I have ever done. I tell this story because of my father who said I love you and that is all I know how to say, and who taught me that imperfect love is the only real love there is. I tell this story because of my mother who decided that her love was larger than her fear. I tell this story because of Clara who said I do not fully understand this yet, but I love you and I want to understand it and I will. I tell this story because of Dr. Reeves who said, stop trying to know, start exploring. I tell this story because of the people in the forums at 2 a.m, the strangers who shared their stories with a vulnerability that gave me the courage to begin living mine. I tell this story because of the boy in the doorway, who deserved to be told the truth, and who waited 33 years to hear it, and who is, finally, breathing. There is one more thing I want to say, and then I will close. I want to say something about shame because shame is the engine that powers the drawer, and I want to talk about what happens when the engine stops. Shame is the belief that you are fundamentally unacceptable. Not that you have done something wrong, but that you are something wrong. Shame is not guilt. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. Shame says, I am a bad thing. And the difference between those two statements is the difference between a feeling you can work with and a feeling that works on you, that corrodes you, that makes you hide and call the hiding protection. I carried shame for 33 years. I carried it the way you carry a stone in your pocket, so constantly that you forget it is there, so persistently that its weight becomes part of your body, and you adjust your posture around it, and you build your life around the compensation for its weight. And you do not even realize how much energy you are spending counterbalancing until the stone is removed, and you stand up straight for the first time, and you feel the lightness, and you think, oh, this is what it feels like to walk without a stone. The stone was not removed by the crossdressing.
I want to be clear about that.
The stone was removed by the honesty. The stone was removed by the telling. The stone was removed by the act of opening my mouth in a quiet living room and saying, I need to tell you something, and by the woman across from me saying, thank you for telling me. The stone was removed by the contract, by the signature, by the commitment to face the truth together instead of alone. The crossdressing, the wearing of the dress, the exploration of feminine expression, these were important. These were part of the process. These were the walking through the door. But the door was opened by honesty, not by clothing. The door was opened by words, and the words were, I need to tell you something, and everything that followed, the therapy and the exploration and the small risks and the large risks and the grief and the joy and the complicated, recursive, ongoing process of becoming, all of it flowed from that single act of speech. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The beginning is not the dress. The beginning is the telling. The beginning is the moment you decide that the cost of hiding has exceeded the cost of honesty, and you open your mouth, and you say the thing you have been afraid to say, and you let the saying be the first step, and you trust that the step will lead to another step, and the other step will lead to another, and the path will appear under your feet as you walk it, the way it appeared under mine, the way it has appeared under the feet of millions of people who stood where you are standing and who decided finally to move. I am not going to tell you that the path is easy. I am not going to tell you that everyone will understand. I am not going to tell you that the people you love will stay, because some of them might not, and that is a real possibility, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What I'm going to tell you is that the path is worth walking. What I'm going to tell you is that the life you find on the other side of the fear is fuller and richer and more honest than the life you are living inside the drawer, and the fullness and the richness and the honesty are worth the cost, even when the cost is high, even when the cost is grief, even when the cost is the 3-month silence of a father who loves you but does not know how to say it. I am going to tell you that you deserve to breathe. I am going to tell you that the room in your house, the one you have not furnished, the one you have been afraid to enter, is yours, and the door is not locked, and the hallway is dark, but your eyes will adjust, and what you find inside the room will not be a monster. It will be yourself. It will be the self you have been running from, the self you have been praying to have removed, the self that has been sitting on your chest at night and pressing against the drawer and waiting, patiently, relentlessly, for you to turn the handle. Turn the handle. Walk through the door. Furnish the room. It is yours. It has always been yours. And the house that contains it, the house that is your life, will be larger and warmer and more fully lived once every room is open and every light is on and every part of you is allowed to exist. That is the story. That is my story, or the part of it I can share, or the part of it that matters, or the shape the river has taken after decades of flow. I do not know if it is the shape it will have in another decade, because the river is still flowing and I am still becoming, and the becoming does not stop, and I do not want it to stop, because the becoming is the life, and the life is the point. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.